What would you like listeners to know about Miss Gregoire's beginning?
So, in the spirit of the suffragette uprising, Miss Gregoire has a mission. She is coming to a new land with a cause. She wants to see justice done for her family. And of course, because this is a historical romance novella series, there's also a lover that she encounters. And at first, she thinks he's going to be an obstacle, then he becomes an ally, and then, of course, he becomes eventually the love of her life. He supports her cause, he leads her to achieve and fulfill her dreams, and he becomes part of her future in really unexpected ways that she didn't imagine. For readers of my other historical romances in the Ladies Least Likely series, there has been in the background of several books this mysterious Miss Gregoire's School or Miss Gregoire's Academy for genteel young ladies, and it's been established in Bath. And what people don't know is that this is a breeding ground for radical, ambitious women. Miss Gregoire is the kind of instructor who teaches her girls whatever they want. She allows them to exercise independent thought. She encourages their ambitions. And she's always been in my mind as this background figure who is, quietly rearing these subversive women who then go on to be the heroines of my ladies least likely in a lot of cases. And so when this opportunity arose to write about a woman, I thought, well, I'm going to take this chance to explore her beginning because I always knew she had a shady past, and this was my chance to find out more about it.
I love it. And I got a chance to read an early draft, and I love the story. I love Olympe and I love Michael. So, is there anything we need to know about the scene before you start reading it?
Olympe is from Alsace, which is a contested part of Europe between Germany and France. It's been in the 18th century switched back and forth several times. It's predominantly German in character. It has its own language, it has its own very unique customs and culture, but it is currently ruled in the time of the story by the French. So they end up, please imagine as I'm reading that their common language is in fact French. Olim's English is not very good at this time, and Michael doesn't know much about Alsace at all, certainly does not speak Alsatian. So perhaps that's the only setup. She's coming from very far away. I'll start with the very beginning, chapter one. Her arms were stiff wooden paddles, her feet tree stumps. If rocks hidden beneath the gray-blue waves cut at her feet, she didn't notice. Her body was numb and had been since she'd left from the rowboat and the man who'd meant to kill her. Of course, he didn't say in so many words he meant to kill her. He'd whispered of something else, something he meant to do with her once they touched shore. Something he said would ensure her safe passage through Plymouth and not a glance from the customs officer or the port officials. Something that would make all the his worth his while, troublesome female that she was. What he offered was the opposite of safe. She'd taken her chances on the sea. Of course, now she was going to die on this beach if her heavy skirts allowed her to reach shore. She moved her limbs forward through will alone, dragging her legs through the water, scooping it away with her palms. The beach floated ever out of reach, a silvery crescent glowing with early dawn. Her body was numb, but her heart had been numb for far longer. At least she had chosen her death, like Gregor and Matisse had, putting themselves in the way of a Prussian shell for the cause of France and glory. She had not been tortured and snuffed out in a prison cell like her father, nor pushed to starvation like others of her homeland, then felled by plague like wheat in the field. There was something almost noble about it, dying alone on a foreign shore. She'd failed in her quest, but no matter. So many thousands had failed already, and would fail again, trying to protect their homes from the ravening maw of war. Of course, she had chosen to wade ashore where there was barely a shore at all, just stark gray cliffs rising straight from the sea, and a hammered silver sky beyond. She laughed to herself, then spit out the salt water that leapt into her mouth from the spray. Her family would say this was typical Olympe, to choose the harder way when there was a softer, overburdening her basket at market rather than selecting no more than what she could carry, walking to the next mountaintop village rather than taking a cart, swimming La Manche instead of taking the smuggler's ship to shore and paying his unscrupulous fee. All at once the tide gave way, as if the earth had tilted, and she slogged onto a pebbled shore. The tiny rocks were rough and cool as she fell to her hands and knees. She rubbed one between her fingers, surprised at the texture, tracing the tiny prints embedded in the hard surface. One design was an arch with flares depending from the spine, another a sunburst curling in on itself like a pillbug. Secret symbols or ancient hieroglyphs here to mark her passage into the next world. She stretched out her body, giving in to the pull of her sodden clothing, and lay her cheek against the stones. A small ray of light, molten gold, peeked around the edge of the eastern cliff and fell on her face, as warm and gentle as a mother's touch. Olympe smiled and heaved a restful sigh. The numbness was a blessing, holding off the pain of waiting. She would see them all again soon. The woman wasn't moving. This was not how Michael wanted to begin his day. Flotsam washed up from wrecks he could understand, or goods the smugglers had jettisoned before the excise officer seized them. But now people? Perhaps she'd fallen. Michael scrambled down the slopes where the spokes of green late summer grass made a more navigable surface than the sharp cliffs where the woman lay face down on the rocks. Bayard, more adept on 4 feet than Michael was on 2, picked his way across the uneven stones and pushed his snout against the woman's pale cheek. Was he imagining things, or did she stir? Michael caught himself as his walking stick slid on the flat-sided fossil. He landed on his feet on the beach with a jarring thud, then briskly made his way to the woman. She lay in a pile of lavender petticoats and a blue embroidered jacket, her hair a dark, wet clump. Her face was disguised under the tongue of his dog, who gave her a determined lick. She raised a small, pale hand and pushed the dog away. Bayard, encouraged by the sign of life, licked her hand. Her eyes fluttered open. Michael didn't quite understand what she muttered, but if it was French, it sounded like hounds of hell. He crouched by her side, ignoring the shriek of pain in his bum leg. The thing was one constant roar of pain these days, damp or dry, warm or cold. The ache was a companion as faithful as his hound, though less welcome. He reached for his rusty French. "You're not in hell, madam. Can you rise?" She muttered something in another language that was not German or Dutch. He guessed a question concerning her whereabouts. "You are in England," he informed her. She rolled to her side with a groan and cast a look of despair at the ragged carved cliffs rising like a curtain wall of an ancient castle. "Angleterre," she muttered, and the word was imbued with more derision than which she'd uttered hell. "But still earth. Are you hurt?" She squinted her eyes at him. The path of her gaze followed his outline, his plain wool coat, the leather breeches, cocked hat, and the sturdy boots he wore for his daily tramps. He looked a common laborer, not a gentleman of some distinction. "Are you an angel?" she asked, sounding rather more alarmed than impressed at the notion. Her French held an accent he couldn't identify, some dialect grown far from Paris. How a Frenchwoman washed up on a Dorset beach he dearly wanted to know. Michael snorted and leaned back on his heels. His thigh screamed. "Far from an angel." "You're glowing," she said dreamily, and he wondered if she might be touched in the head. Then she reached out her hand, fingers wrinkled from the water, and touched his knee, testing his solidity. All of a sudden, his leg didn't hurt anymore. "The sun is behind me," he said gruffly. The swish of water along the pebbled shore reminded him. "And the tide is coming in. We'd best move you." He stood first, bones creaking, and held out his arm, leaning on his cane. Where 10 years ago he'd have lifted her in his arms and carried her up the slope, perhaps to the public house for shelter, or to his own house, though it lay half a mile away. The exertion would have meant nothing to him. But that was 10 years ago. "Nothing broken, that's a relief." She pushed up into a sitting position, and he saw her more clearly. A linen cloth unraveled from around her neck, barely clinging to the deep bodice framing a lovely set of breasts. Her fitted jacket tucked into a trim waist and flared over the pleats of her petticoat. If she'd had an apron, it had washed away along with her cap. She was dressed like a commoner and displayed none of the mincing ways of a well-bred English gentlewoman. She took his hand in a sturdy grip and hauled herself to her feet with an unladylike grunt. The top of her matted dark brown curls came to his nose. She tipped back her head to study his face, and Michael sucked in his breath. She was uncommonly beautiful. Her eyes were large and heavy-lidded under high, arched brows. Her nose was a straight slope with just a hint of pertness at the tip. Her chin might be dainty, but her mouth was not. It was a wide slash with full pink lips, and her smile showed all her teeth were yet in place, one front tooth slightly overlapping the other. The angel Gabriel, she said. He stared into her eyes, feeling strangely as if the water had suddenly swirled around them, pulling at his balance, tugging him off his feet. She was on the young side of womanhood, her skin clear as skimmed cream, and the cool morning wind teased the pink bloom of sea thrift into her cheeks. The earth and stones of the beach washed out beneath him, leaving him suddenly at sea. Michael, he said, his voice rough. My name is Michael. Chief of the Archangels, she murmured. A bark from Bayard drew her attention. With a dog. He held in a breath, freed for the moment from the potent spell of her eyes. And you fell off a passing boat, he guessed. Or took an evening swim in your own land and were washed across the channel by the tides? Or are you a Selkie and you forgot to don your seal coat before you swam out to sea? She stepped forward and gasped sharply, clutching at his arms. He slid his hands to her waist and caught her. The fabric was cold and damp beneath his palms, but the slender body beneath was firm and would be warm. An outrageous urge seized him to tuck her close, fit her hips against his, wrap his arms around her narrow shoulders, and press her breasts against his chest. It had been quite some time since the nearness of a woman struck him with such craving, sparking a fire deep in his gut. Why this one? Carefully he steadied her, keeping a respectful distance. Pretend Netta was watching, he told himself. Pretend his mother was here. Are you hurt? He asked again. She winced, one side of her lovely mouth drawing into a pucker. The rocks, they're sharp. I've lost my slippers. They both stared at her feet. Her stockings, wool, not dainty silk, were torn beyond repair. Her toes peeked through the rents, nails like tiny seashells. His gut tightened at the sight of her skin, bared to the world. I can try to carry you. He shifted on his feet, bracing himself, holding out his arms. But he favored his right leg, and that betrayed him. She regarded his walking stick, then him. There was no scorn in her gaze, no disappointment, no sudden decision that his limp made him less than a man. Yet. May I have your arm? Of course. She pitched toward him again as a rock turned beneath her sole, and he caught her easily, lightly, as if they'd rehearsed the move, as if he were prepared, had been preparing for years, for this woman to fall into his arms.
What a beautiful scene. Thank you so much. I have lots of questions for you, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors.